Good morning. My name is David Steiner. I'm the Executive Director here at the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy. It's my pleasure to welcome you on my behalf, but also on behalf of the National Assessment Governing Board. We're going to be discussing the nation's reading results that came out very recently. I'd like to first introduce my very esteemed colleagues on this panel, starting with Dr. Kerry Wright, the State Superintendent of Schools for my state of Maryland and a former governing board member of the National Assessment Board. Carol Yago, Associate Director of the California Reading and Literature Project, UCLA, and also a former governing board member. And Dr. Daniel Willingham, Professor of Psychology at the University of Virginia. We will begin by hearing from Dr. Laura Lugerfo, who is Assistant Director, Reporting and Analysis for the Governing Board, who's actually going to give us a snapshot of the results. So over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Dr. Steiner, for having us. And thank you to everyone who's joining us today. Let me share my screen. Hopefully you all can see that. Great. So last week, we released the 2024 Nations Report Card in Reading and Mathematics for grades 4 and 8. It made some splashes in various newspapers. And we're just going to focus on reading today, although we also had math results for the nation, 53 states and jurisdictions, and 26 urban districts. So if we look, let's see. There we go. So this was, I believe, called sobering news, dismal news, grim news, but nationally scores are below 2019 levels in reading and math at grades 4 and 8. Reading continued to decline in both grades 4 and 8. In math, there was a bright spot in grade 4, where there was a slight increase over 2022. And in grade 8, there was no change from 2022. So 8th grade math scores are flat. 4th grade math shows some promise. But what we're here to talk about today in reading, it's concerning that the decline in reading started before the pandemic and has continued to slide even as school has resumed post-pandemic. We're seeing higher than ever percentages of students below NAEP proficient. In 2024 is the greatest percentage of students scoring on that side of that line, which differentiates proficient from basic and below NAEP basic. Keep in mind that NAEP proficient is a challenging achievement level to reach. It's a bit more complex concepts, knowledge, and skills than what you might think of with proficient for state assessments. But we definitely want to, we always keep that line there because we like to keep proficient and high expectations high, because it's important. Although the news generally was not what we wanted to hear, we do want to emphasize that progress is possible. And the real benefit of NAEP are its long trend lines. We can look back to 1990, 1992. This graph here goes back to 2000. And you can see that there have been times where there have been progress made not only overall, but also in helping elevate the students at the 25th, who are the struggling students, lower performers, and the 75th percentile students, who are the more higher achieving students. Right now, those groups are actually diverging, that the achievement gap is growing. However, in the past, with effort and obviously focus, we have had times where they have narrowed. So it is good to keep that in mind, that progress is possible. And we actually have even longer trend lines, but it's in a different NAEP. Occasionally you'll hear the long-term trend versus main NAEP. Those are not the most eloquent phrases to describe the two, but long-term trend goes back to the early 1970s. So if you think as main NAEP is reaching back to the parents of the students who were assessed last year, you might think of these as the grandparents of the students who were assessed last year. And you can see also progress was made. There is that incline going up in the 90s and the aughts. And then around 2012, you can see that there has been a bit of a decline. the long-term trend is a more assessment that's focused more on fundamentals. It's a different test altogether. They ages 9 and 13, more fundamental concepts and skills being assessed. And it happens kind of when we can. Whereas the main NAEP, which stretches back to the 1990s, goes with grades 4 and 8 and 12. Grade 12 will be released. The next results, the 2024 results, will be released in likely early summer of 2025. So just to give you a picture of how reading looks across the nation, and that's it. I will turn it back over to Dr. Steiner. Thank you.
Thank you. You take your... There we go. So I'm going to start with a very obvious question, which is what would make a difference to move more students to the point where they can read effectively and proficiently? None better to start answering that question than Dr. Kerry Wright, whose former state of Mississippi made remarkable results in 4th grade. Suffice to say that not only are they reading better than the national average, they're also reading better than her current state of Maryland, where I'm sitting, which is one of the wealthiest in the country. So she's got her work cut out in Maryland, but she did an extraordinary job in Mississippi. So Kerry, why don't we start with you? What would make a difference for the nation?
Well, I think, and thank you. Thanks for having me, David. I appreciate being here. I've always been focused and continue to remain focused on utilizing evidence-based practices. And I think stick to the research. What the research is telling you over time is effective. And so that is exactly what we did in Mississippi and what we're trying to do here in Maryland. And I say that by saying the science of reading is something that Mississippi, we started in 13, 14 and continue down in that state today. Our state board here in Maryland has passed a policy. Actually, it was a resolution last year that starting in the 24-25 school year, all schools will be implementing the science of reading. We had started that earlier with some Maryland Leads money as well. Job embedded coaching, having somebody, there's a lot of research that supports having a strong coach right beside a teacher to model lessons, to give feedback, to work with other staff members, making sure children have high quality instructional materials in front of them, and making sure that teachers know the difference between what is something of high quality and not. I'm a firm believer in building teacher and leader capacity. I think a lot of folks come to the job absolutely knowing what to do, and others can be have their skills improved. So high quality professional learning on an ongoing basis, not just a one-time get it, we hope you get it, but it's again and again and again. And strong, coherent, and relentless execution on sound strategies. I mean, this is something that you do over time, again and again, and you monitor the daylights out of it, and then using that data to monitor what's happening with student achievement, and then how do you use that data to change instructional practices and continue to build teachers and leaders in order to do that work in school. So to me, that's the essence, that's the foundation of what we do to make sure that our children are learning to read and read well.
Thank you, Kerry. Carol, perspective from you.
Well, from 30 years in a classroom, one or two things I know for sure is that you only get good at reading by reading. Mm-hmm. And maybe one of the many reasons students are reading less is that their teachers aren't asking them to read more. You know, to build on what Laura told us about progress being possible, and that in the past there was progress. Maybe this is a moment when teachers can look back, at their syllabi from 10, 15 years ago and really look in the mirror and ask ourselves, were you teaching fewer books? What was the complexity of those texts? And everybody understands what happened during the pandemic. What I worry about and what I observe is that we haven't gotten back to a more rigorous curriculum and instruction, the kind of thing that Kerry's describing. And again,
may I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? There has been a fire emergency report.
Somebody there we go. Go ahead. A fire emergency seems appropriate for our reading results as a nation.
It is a hair on fire moment.
Right.
And I don't think more rigor means a terrible classroom and being mean to students. I think it's a liberating thing when students have the skill. So we need to stop saying reading is fun, not because it can't be, but
Right.
because it doesn't need to be fun to do it. And
Got it.
to help students embrace that work.
Well, Dan has actually had to have a fire alarm. I mean, he is going to come back as soon as he can. I want to add something to the result picture. The other state alongside with Mississippi that really did astonishingly well in 8th grade continues to be Louisiana.
Mhm.
And since the work of John White and work we've been privileged to do with him, of putting high quality instructional materials with great deal of content in front of the students. I want to say over 90% of Louisiana's teachers use very high quality curriculum, mostly something called guidebooks, which obviously does focus on the science of reading in the early grades. There is phonics, phonemic awareness, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, but also builds that background knowledge, which we know is so key to later reading proficiency. Louisiana remarkably matched the nation for 8th grade results. Think about the poverty rates in Louisiana compared to the nation. And the other really extraordinary thing about Louisiana is that it showed in 8th grade no dip during the whole COVID period, right?
Mhm.
In other words, it was a result that was so robust in terms of what was happening in the classrooms that it withstood even that assault, if you will, that was so difficult for the rest of the nation. So I think the combination of the rigorous approach that Kerry has brilliantly championed in Mississippi and the insistence that we build background knowledge from the beginning, which has been the hallmark of Louisiana's work. I think while we always, the academic in me says, be careful over interpreting trends, right? But I think at this point, looking at multiple test results over multiple years, we do have some right to call those two states out and to make that point, right, about what they are doing and their success. We will look with interest at the 12th grade results to see if that 8th grade right carries through. But everything we know from Don Hirsch and others about background knowledge really speaks to that Louisiana result, which I wanted to call out. Let's move on to the next question, which is, if we know what to do, right? We know we need to teach this, the phonics, the phonemic awareness, the vocabulary. We know we need to teach that background knowledge. We've known this at least since the year 2000 with the National Reading Panel report, right? What are the barriers to doing it? Why are we seeing such a problem in all the other states, as it were, and indeed some dramatic declines in some states when we have the evidence so much staring us in the face? Kerry, I hope you can explain this because I can't.
Well, I can. So part of me, I think, for some teachers, it's scary to jump into something that you don't really know. You've done something the same way for so long, and you're comfortable in that. I kind of liken it to William Bridges has a book called Managing Transitions, and there's a kind of this analogy, this picture that I picture in my mind of this high wire acrobat, and they've got a hold of one swing, and they've got to let go and grab the next one in order to get across. But in the middle, when you're kind of in the middle of change, it's a little scary. So you've got to have, that's why I say teachers have to be supported in this process, because it's not just something you can tell somebody to do and then have them do it. It's something that you've got to make sure that there are, the professional learning that's involved there. I think also I think we need I'm a firm believer in strong policy making, because I think that has a lot to do with it, and also stronger accountability measures, because to me, policy and accountability drive behavior. And so if you're wanting something to be paid attention to, then it's imperative that you have strong policy and strong accountability measures on that. I also think people sometimes get involved in implementation, but don't really step back to take a look at the actual fidelity of the implementation. Is everybody rowing in the same direction? And over time, and that's something you've got to just be relentless about, relentless in monitoring, relentless in giving feedback, relentless in celebrating when things are going well. But you've got to keep your eye on the ball 24/7. That's all I can say. This isn't a profession you can let up on. You got to stick with it and support people in the process.
I want to just follow up quickly, because generally I think it's fair to say this country has stepped away from accountability, right? That we are in Massachusetts, right? It made news that the famous MCAS was being dropped. In my old state, in New York, I was distressed to hear that the regents are being made optional or partially optional. As you know, only 8 or 9 states now have a required high school graduation test. If we stop measuring this, the idea seems to be, then the kids will stop doing poorly. I don't know where this mania for retreat from using a thermometer comes from, right? But it strikes me as actually rather dangerous.
I agree. I totally agree with you, David. I think that, I mean, we're getting ready to take another look at Maryland's accountability model. I've told the story in December when I first got there in 23. The statewide assessment director said 76% of our schools and districts are rated as 3, 4, or 5 stars. And we have a 47% proficiency rate in reading and a 27% proficiency rate in mathematics. And I thought, there's not an equal sign there. Those two things do not equal. So we put together a task force that's looking, and we spent a good part of time doing it. Center for Assessment led the work, and looking at what goes into a strong assessment system, because we're getting ready to put out an RFP for a brand new assessment system, which I might add, we've included in the scope of work that we wanted to mirror the rigor of NAEP, and also a new accountability model, because right now, I don't think our accountability model is really working the way the accountability models are supposed to. I saw the essence of having a strong accountability model in Mississippi, and the difference that it made when people were really paying attention to what was inside the accountability model and then doing something about it in classrooms.
Got it.
You know,
Carol, national barriers to make it better.
David, the obvious barrier that, you know, an article a minute is being written about in the press is the barrier of social media, of students being addicted to their phones, of a screen-based childhood. And I think we need to stop using that as an excuse. We're on a screen right now. Screens are not going away. What I believe we need to do is to help students to become more aware of the impact of that on themselves as learners, on their own literacy development. And when you get a message, let's say you're reading something online and AI asks you, want me to summarize this for you? Like, what 12-year-old wouldn't rather read 3 sentences than 3 pages? Like and the student will tell you, I'm working smarter, not harder. No, working harder is part of what brings growth. Learning growth comes from some of the hard work. I mean, it's become a 4-letter word. We need to return, oh God, I'm going to say it, homework, but not busy work homework. We need to use make sure that every minute of classroom time is golden and used for reading and writing, and that we can have expectations that students read outside of school. You can't get there just within the school day, but it's not going to be easy. I don't pretend that the lure of the screen for all of us isn't incredibly powerful.
I want to pick up on that in my own thoughts. It's not much said, but when we look at the PISA results, the international results, they're dismal in math, they're dismal in science. It's awkward, but the news in reading is quite good, actually. We are, if you just count the nations, look, not brilliant, we're eighth, but we're eighth out of 80 compared to being in the 30s, right, in math and science. And when you dig into the difference, why NAEP, right, is so disappointing and PISA, reasonably okay, nothing to celebrate, we should be near the top of the world. The answer seems to be that the PISA test much more closely mirrors social media, right? It's informational, it's different kinds of visuals that you have to interpret. Whereas NAEP, goodness bless them, still asks for you to read some fiction, right? There is no fiction on the PISA test. So I guess one question I have is whether we should just give up on testing serious reading about, the deep human condition, and just go with PISA with these, good snippets of informational text. Right, I see you shake your head.
Never give up. Snippets, snippets will never do it. And again, assessment influences instruction.
Yes.
If we want our classrooms to be places where big ideas, serious thinking takes place, we need to embrace this closer piece. One other thing you mentioned, though, I think this is worth thinking about. NAEP math isn't just a bunch of numbers on the page.
Right.
And it's very possible that students who are performing in the lowest percentiles in reading are having their math results depressed as a result of not being able to read the items.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Gary, what are your thoughts here on the NAEP PISA business?
Well, I think there's a balance that we've got to strike too. I think that, I mean, as an avid reader, I pretty much try to operate under read fiction, read nonfiction, read fiction, read nonfiction.
Yeah.
And I think that because I think you talked about it earlier, David. I mean, the whole point of building background knowledge, or whether it's background knowledge or just brand new knowledge that's coming out, I think children need to be doing both. So I'm a both and rather than an either or.
Yeah.
I think that it's important that they know how to read fiction, but I also think it's critical that they know how to read nonfiction, because there's so much. That's how they gain a lot of additional knowledge in all the other subjects, because science is typically not written in fiction, and unless it's science fiction, no pun intended. But I think that they've got to be able to ascertain information from a variety of sources, and so I think to me there just needs to be a balance in that.
Just to go on with that, I just wholeheartedly agree that this idea of text sets within a curriculum that has as its backbone building knowledge, and that invites students to explore a topic. That's how we're going to build background knowledge. And without that background knowledge, reading at a high school level is really, really hard. And that comes from the nonfiction, the informational text. I also think there's a gender issue going on here. A lot of boys would rather read about real things. So if we're wondering why they're not becoming readers, let's look at what we're offering them.
Right. I will stand up for the role of fiction in teaching us about the human condition. I don't think it doesn't teach, but that's a different topic. We are collecting questions. I wanted to say this in the chat, which we will address towards the end. But one is very relevant that's come in for this discussion, reminding us that schools of education, in which I'm speaking to you from, have a role here, right, in preparing teachers of reading. And we only recently crossed the threshold where more than 50% of schools of ed were even teaching the science of reading. Carrie, talk to me a little bit about Mississippi and what you did about teacher prep, which is so crucial.
Well, we certainly, it came along a lot slower than I would have hoped that it did. I do think one of the things that we did that made a difference for some professors was we invited them to all of our professional learning training when we started the letters training around the science of reading. They were invited to attend for free as well, so that we could let them know what the expectation was. Like, this is what we are expecting all teachers to know and be able to do. And so I think some teachers really embraced it. Others really kind of pushed back, like that wasn't something they felt that they needed to do. But it always kind of bothered me that we were having to spend additional state dollars after children and parents and grandparents had spent 4 years of a college education, and then the state was having to come back in and reteach, if you will, how to teach reading. And so I was so often thinking, gosh, if they came in prepared, what could we be using this money for, to further that pace? But it was money well spent, because I think you can see from the results, even from Mississippi's results, from this past time, they have definitely rebounded from pre-pandemic. And I think that it makes a difference when you build that kind of foundation. That's what you want to see. That's what I'm talking about, year after year, consistently making sure that we're doing what we need to be doing. And that also means for the teachers that are brand new to our profession.
I agree. I mean, I will, this is on me and on many former commissioners, but we have scars on our back from trying to move teacher prep, right? I mean, in theory, commissioners of education in states have the authority to refuse to accredit schools of education that don't teach the science of reading. And almost no one uses that authority because of the politics, right, of trying to interfere in higher education. It's a hornet's nest, as I can see you smiling. And of course, Carol's also involved in an institution of higher education. I mean, all of us have had this experience of trying to move these institutions. But as long as they don't prepare the teachers, it's left to the state to do it later and more expensively. And it's a mess. Carol, your thoughts on higher ed?
But one of the things that immediately comes to mind is, just as we've talked about, teaching children how to read isn't the end product. We need 3rd, 4th, 5th grade to help them develop as readers. The same thing is true of teachers. You'll never be a really good teacher of reading unless you are a reader. And so to develop, and this is harder and it's messier, but we need to like, this is a societal change. This is a cultural shift that we need to help implement so that we really can become a nation of readers again. Right.
So Dan, welcome back.
People think academia is boring. We lead very exciting lives, actually.
Right. So we've talked about Louisiana and the building of background knowledge, talked about Mississippi and the science of reading. We've talked about teacher prep and the struggle, right, to change institutions like yours, mine, and many others to focus on the science of reading. In terms of barriers to getting better national results, right, would you add anything to that mix?
I think all of these points are essential, and they speak to the fact that we do know some of the important ingredients. But I think the biggest barrier right now is diagnostics. I'm reminded of my students when they perform poorly on an examination. They come to see me to talk about what they ought to do. And in my students' mind, the answer is always, I need to study more. I need to, just pound out those hours. And my response is always like, it could be that your studying is fine. You're actually spending enough time. It's that the methods are inefficient, or it could be you're not taking good notes, or it could be your listening skills, right? There's all these ingredients that go into it. And as we talk about national results, we of course expect that different localities may be doing some things right, but other things incorrectly. And so to me, that's the biggest barrier, is we don't want to end up telling, suggesting that that instructors or leadership do more of X when actually they've kind of got X down, and it's another ingredient. So that's what I would really like to see, is better diagnostics.
Yeah. We, in terms, going back since you missed it, because I know this is such an important topic to you, the background knowledge, right? When we're talking about building background knowledge to make, better readers when you're reading to learn rather than learning to read. So we're talking about those somewhat older students, if they've mastered the phonics and phonemic awareness. Is there any structure to the background knowledge? Should it be, is there a magic formula? Do we do geography, history, science in some kind of order? Or do we really just not know very much yet about how to most effectively build this background knowledge?
I think there are two basic principles to think about. One is, in terms of what the content should be, it depends on what you want children to know and what you want them to be effective in reading about and thinking about. When you put it that way, it sounds painfully obvious that if a child knows a whole lot about a topic, they're much more effective in reading about it and thinking about it than if they don't know very much about it. But the second principle is a little more subtle, and that is that the principle that seems obvious to us about mathematics applies to reading and thinking as well, which is that it is hierarchical. As you're mastering topic X, there are topics that have come before that are very important to help you understand topic X. That's very obvious in math. It's more subtle in reading, but it's equally true in reading. So when we think about what's the magic formula, what's the secret sauce, it's not just a knowledge-rich curriculum. It's a knowledge-rich curriculum that is carefully sequenced, right? The ideal is that when we put a text in front of a child for the child to read, they have all the background knowledge in place in order to comprehend that text comfortably, but maybe not quite everything, so that they reach just a little bit.
Yep. Good point. Carrie, you want to add anything to
Just
that?
Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. What's the point? Why do you need a teacher if you're not stretching students to do work they couldn't quite do without you? That's, I mean, to me, that's the argument against always making sure that what students are reading in class is easy. But like, I want you to read easy books at home on your own. We'll come back and talk about it. But with me, I want to be pushing you in the best possible way, and with lots of encouragement, saying, you can do this. I'm here for you. Don't worry about but always having, I don't know, a goal that's beyond what you can do today.
Well, I think that what is a little bit of encouraging signs here from the industry, a number of publishers of strong ELA curriculum are realizing that children and teachers need ramps, right, to reach the rigorous tier 1 instruction, and are beginning to think about pre-unit, diagnostics, to go back to your point, Dan, and materials that prepare you. So, for example, before you read The Great Gatsby, you get some exposure to the Jazz Age, right? To what's going on in America socially, economically, racially, before you just are plunged into the text. And I think we've got a lot of work to do to build that sequential knowledge in the way Dan is suggesting, not just overall in our tier 1 curriculum, but in enabling kids, right, to access that reading. Because right now, a lot of those teachers, essentially, they're not using the rigorous curriculum. We know this, right? They're still using stuff from Pinterest and Teachers Pay Teachers. They're mixing it. They're using the rigorous curriculum for very few purposes. They don't use it because they don't like it, right? They've decided they don't like it because they haven't used it. Go ahead, Carrie.
I was just going to say a compliment to a middle school teacher I had. To your point, David, I had a middle school English teacher that just absolutely turned me on to Shakespeare. And I'll never forget when we first wandered into that whole genre of Shakespeare, he took the time to do exactly what you were saying. He took the time to really explain this is going to sound a little different. It's going to read a little different. Let me tell you about what was going on at the time that this was taking place. So he built this whole aura around, now we're going to plunge into this, and very patient with us as we were learning to read Shakespeare. And I think, and that was really just, it opened a whole new world for me that I would never have thought about picking up a book and reading. But he was masterful at really enticing you and then supporting you in the process as you were going through reading those plays.
Yes, I think
And
it's
to
really
think about how different that is from rewriting text to make them easier and easier and easier
yes,
Mhm.
yes,
for
yes.
students, or doing the reading for students,
Mhm.
right.
which happens in a lot of classrooms. And the only person getting better at that moment is the teacher. That's the only person who's getting better reading,
Yes,
which is
it's
not
a
to
great
say
point.
that there isn't tremendous power in reading aloud to students, but you should be reading aloud a book that they could, again, that they couldn't read on their own, that's building that rich literary language, academic language that isn't in our conversation.
No, it's a great point, Carol. I mean, all of us have been in classrooms where we watch while the teacher answers her own or his own question, right?
It's
Then,
an occupational hazard.
right,
David. I've done it too.
restates it at a much more basic level, right? We see this again and again. We need to address what's perhaps the most distressing part of the whole NAEP picture, which is that wealthy children continue more or less unaffected, right, by COVID, by whatever. Their results are as strong as they were before, maybe a little better, maybe not. Meanwhile, the declining scores on average are concealing the fact that the reason the average is going down is our least privileged students are doing substantially worse over time. That's the 5-alarm fire for me, right? Is that disparate and increasing achievement gap, or opportunity gap, as it's sometimes called. I really would like to hear from all of you on this. Carrie, let's start with you. What do we have to do?
Yeah. That's one thing. Mississippi's got the highest rate of poverty in the nation.
Yes.
And if you take a look at Mississippi's most recent scores, their children in poverty are #1 in the nation in 4th grade reading, outperforming their national peers and their regional peers.
Yes.
And we went about that, and it's the same is true here in Maryland. We're going about this in terms of making sure that all kids know how to read using the science of reading, because I think that has got to be, reading to me is the gatekeeper for the world. And I think that children that live in poverty typically also don't have as many books at home or are not read to. So we've got to make sure that we are building that environment at school that exposes them to that. But it also, how do we build that environment at home that continues that as well? Because parent engagement, I think, is absolutely critical. Parents want to do the very best for their children. And sometimes we just need to help them with the strategies that are most appropriate for them to be using at home. But I think we've got to really lean in, particularly on those that are struggling the most. And I will say, you've got to identify who those kids are. Behind every data point is a face. And if you don't know the face, you don't know the need. And it's not like looking at a whole subgroup and saying, our lowest performers are X, whatever that X happens to be. But every child needs to be identified, and every child's needs aren't the same. So as professionals, it's on us to do that in the classroom. And then how do we help parents continue that work at home as well?
Got it. Dan, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the truth is that rich children are by definition going home to very well resourced homes every afternoon and evening. And so to the extent that parents perceive their child is not getting what they need at school, rich parents are in a position to provide that, whatever it is. If that ends up being tutoring, then it's going to be tutoring. If that's an environment that has more opportunities to gain the type of background knowledge that we're talking about, that sort of comes as a matter of course. And so anytime we talk about education, this is on my mind, that there are a large percentage of children in the United States for whom this is their only opportunity. There are some kids who can learn at home, and their parents have lots of resources, to financial resources, social resources, and there are many children who don't. And so it's absolutely essential that everything a child needs to succeed is available during the school day. I very much agree with Carrie that every parent wants to help. Every parent wants their child to succeed, of course. And we should do all we can to help support those parents and provide ideas about what they can do to continue the work that their child has done during the school day. We also have to be cognizant of the fact that some of those parents, as much as they're game to do it, do not have the time, do not have the resources to do it. If they're working 2 or 3 jobs, it's not in the cards. So and support parents where we can, but also recognize this is on us.
Got it. Carol?
I think I'm just agree with everything that's being said. And I think in working with parents, we've got to go way beyond sending home an electronic newsletter.
Right.
And thinking that is engaging parents. We need to bring parents in this might sound tremendously idealistic, but as a school is trying to address this hair on fire moment, we need to bring together parents, maybe students, as part of this community building of how we're going to change the equation, how we're going to become a community of readers, a literate center within our community.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
but
I'm
can I-
going to
oh,
just
sorry.
share a quick data point here. This is from the Federal Reserve. This is the share of distribution of household wealth in the United States. What's very striking to me, and I'm not proclaiming any causation here, just pointing a correlation, but look at the explosion of the spread around 2012, 13. It starts and it gets extremely bad, right? It gets worse and worse. The wealthier members of our society gaining more and more, and you can barely see the bottom 50%. I mean, you really have to squint. It's that tiny line at very bottom of the graphic, and I think this points to several things. One, the extraordinary against the odds success of places like Mississippi and Louisiana, right? That they have managed to help children, right, despite this trend. But it is clear that the advantages that accrue to, that you were talking about, Dan, right, that accrue to more affluent families have been accruing, right, at an accelerated rate. More and more, a higher and higher share of our resources as a nation are moving towards those who are already well off. And I think it would be naive to completely disregard, right, the background socioeconomics of our country when looking at these long-term NAEP results, because they're real, right? I mean, this is not something that's, extraneous to a child's life, to a child's experience. And it does really point to the incredible necessity of hard work on behalf of, for all of us, in really making school a counter experience, right, to that background.
Yeah, I was going to share. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please, Carrie.
I was going to share an anecdote. I remember being in front of a group of superintendents when I first got down to Mississippi, and one of the superintendents stood up in front of all of his colleagues and said, "How do you expect us to teach all these poor kids?"
Right.
And I said, "Well, you take control over what you have control over, and you've got control over the school day. So what you do between 9 and 3:30 or whatever is the most critical part of that child's day. And how are you managing your master schedule? How are you ensuring that core instruction is taking place? How are you ensuring that interventions are being provided during the school day?" I mean, it's everything that goes back to what we have control over, because we don't, when they go home, we don't. But we can help on that end, but we have control over the school day, and we've got to make it the best it can be.
Right. I want to turn towards some of the questions because they're really good from the audience. One person brought up something that I'm surprised none of us have raised, which is this issue of chronic absenteeism, right?
Yes.
And what's happening now, there's been some improvement, right, since the immediate post-COVID phase, but it's presumably cumulative in its impact on education for those who are chronically absent. It's going to, you know, their performance is going to continue to disintegrate. As a state leader in Maryland and Mississippi, Carrie, can you say a few words about what we can do about this as a nation? Because obviously it's impacting the worst off, right? Disproportionately.
Absolutely. And it's alive and well here. I mean, you know, we have set a goal of reducing chronic absenteeism by 50% over the next 2 years. And we're working with Attendance Works, and Hetty Chang is working with a group here to really start building out some guidance around that. And it really, the biggest impact I think that we can make is at the school level. Is there a strategy at the school level for reaching out to parents when children are not in school? And it's got to be that deliberate. It can't just be that you can't hope that chronic absenteeism is just going to go away. I think one of the things that's also educating parents that chronic absenteeism includes excused absences. So I think parents sometimes think, oh, well, if they're sick, then that they're excused. Well, it is, but it still builds into that. Or I'm taking my child to visit X college for a college visit. That still is part of it. So I think educating parents on what it is, A, and B, making sure that we've got strategies at schools around attendance committees that, or have parents that call homes each day for every child that's absent, assigning an adult in the building to a child who's frequently absent to make sure that that adult in the building is constantly checking in with them, checking in with their family. It has to be deliberate if we're going to reduce it. It's going to have to be done in a very deliberate way.
I often think of it as like students who are chronically absent have a Swiss cheese experience of the curriculum.
Right.
And every teacher in the world has had a student turn to you and say, I'm going to be absent tomorrow. Are we going to do anything? And, you know, the cynic in me wants to say, no, sweetheart, we're just going to wait until you get back. No, but what is different today than it was 15 years ago? Home isn't boring. Home, you got your phone, you've got the internet, and I think that is contributing to students to these terrible attendance rates. We also need to make sure that curriculum and instruction are such that we need to be a magnet. I want students not to want to miss class.
Right.
Oh my gosh, we're going to be talking about X, and I did that reading, so I want to be there. So it's both, from both ends, a magnet and also to reaching out.
Got it. Thank you.
I just want to add a little bit to what Carol said. I was thinking along the same lines that chronic absenteeism may be one metric of a broader problem that I think we all feel, which is a sense that students are just more dispirited now, that they don't feel they're certainly not, they're less attracted to school than they used to be. And also they feel that it's less important, that missing school, you know, at least, you know, you might feel a little bit bad if you stay home to play video games. It feels less like they feel bad about it. It just doesn't seem to matter very much. I think about other data, again, starting in 2013, indicating the frequency with which teenagers affirm, yes, I am often bored. That's been increasing since 2013 and seems to go hand in hand with this feeling among some of our students that nothing much matters much, and certainly school is not anything that matters much. That's a deep problem, but if chronic absenteeism is one facet of that, then we have to see it for what it is.
It's also, I know that we're focusing on reading and literacy, but one of the things that brings students to school in high school, in middle and high school, are extracurricular activities. They're in the band. They're in chorus. They're on a sports team. That's not a bad thing. That's something to capitalize on.
Yeah. I mean, this is a paradox because Jalmeda and others have shown that, you know, you learn much in your drama club, right? In your extracurricular. And yet we also know that some of the constructivist approaches to reading, all right, and the whole child and the whole language did a lot of damage. So we want rigorous instruction, but we want it to be a magnet, as Carol said, right? So we've got this paradox for some teachers who worry that if they stick to the curriculum, to the script, right, they're going to bore students. They're going to not be reaching them, that the students will find it a turnoff. It is, isn't it? I'm asking non-rhetorically, a challenge for schools of education, for all of us, to help our teachers see that rigorous instruction can be exciting instruction, right? And that paradox has to be solved. Right?
One other piece of that a curriculum that you're using isn't denying you your creativity as a teacher. I do not believe most teachers have the time to make up a curriculum on their own.
Right.
If you talk to young teachers, they don't want to do that. They want to work with students. And yet you get a lot of pushback to programs sometimes that, oh, it's boxing me in. Only if you let it.
Right. One question that's come in on this question of background knowledge and shared knowledge. Do we even agree as a society about what children should, in fact, know and learn about? We've all heard the cliche that you can look it up, right? I often use the example of string theory. I ask people to look it up. Of course, by the third equation, they're completely lost because they have no background in the mathematics or the physics. So it's not always a question of looking it up. But beyond the sort of counter examples, to what degree as a nation can we agree on bodies of knowledge that need to be taught? Dan, why don't we start with you on this?
Yeah, I think more than most people suspect, and there has been some work on this. When you really get down to brass tacks and start mapping, it's easy to think about what would be controversial, right? But the controversial parts of a curriculum, I think, are really in a minority. And there has been some work on this where people have sat down with groups of adults and said, what do you think that children ought to learn, and so forth. And then when it comes to the controversial parts, I mean, these are difficult conversations. What you don't want to do is what I think too often ends up happening, which is at state standards level, you have horse trading where it's like, I'll let yours in if you'll let mine in. And then you end up with these very swollen standards that teachers can't possibly meet. That's to be actively avoided. But other than that, yeah, there are going to be some difficult conversations, and this is part of the beauty of the American system. We do have local control. It should reflect the values of the locality to which it applies. So I think it's less of a problem than people suspect.
Thank you for that. Talking about local control, we've managed to avoid politics wonderfully for the last 52 minutes, but we couldn't quite get through the hour without it. There used to be national programs, federal programs. Reading First may ring a bell for some of you. Is there a federal role in addressing this reading situation without raising centrally any of the very recent political gestations around the Department of Education? But should there be a federal policy, a federal grant set of grants around approaches to reading? What's your feeling here, Kerry?
Well, I think that's probably not a bad idea, David. I think that the federal, do think the federal government has a role here in terms of grant making, convening. That's another thing that I think is very powerful. I know the Council of Chief State School Officers is getting ready to conduct a math summit in March, just like they conducted a literacy summit after the 19 results came out. And I think that really, to bring a focus on what is happening actually happening, to convene key researchers, people that have done this, people that know this work, to be able to share ideas across states. I think is very powerful. I know CCSSO has done a great job of doing that, and we've been the beneficiaries because, you know, I've been able to find out what was going on in Louisiana, you know, when John was doing his work, and likewise, you know, people contacting me. And so I think that if you're giving states grants to say, you know, with best practices, let me start that with a research-based
Yes.
implementation behind it, then I think people would welcome that.
Yeah.
I immediately think about the Library of Congress. I just finished work on a project with the National Council of Teachers of English and the Library of Congress to come up to design lessons, rationales for using this cornucopia of primary sources and bring them into the classroom, and to again use it as a incredible resource. Yes, I think the library, and I think the Library of Congress does a wonderful job with all their, you know, the National Poet Laureates and bringing literacy to the American people.
So the last question goes to our challenge of making teaching more attractive as a profession, right? Because we can't improve literacy instruction without the teachers, without the committed teachers, the passionate teachers, the good teachers. We all know that there's something of a crisis in terms of enrollments in teacher prep programs. They're down almost 50% over the last decade. It doesn't seem to be a very attractive profession right now. Thoughts on remedying that? I mean, in the Far East, you can be a specialist of curriculum. You can be a specialist as a mentor. You can be a specialist as a data expert, as a teacher leader. Here in America, we largely say be a teacher forever or be an administrator, right? So that may be one difference, but there are surely many others, and not just pay, though pay, of course, is important, not just the entry pay, but the level of advancement you can make through a career. But thoughts on the teaching profession. Carol, why don't we start with you?
Have people talk to me. I think it is the most wonderful life you could have. One, to be surrounded by young people and to have an opportunity to sow seeds to help them more than make a living, make a life. It's work that matters. And for me, that is the best reason of all to become a teacher.
Dan.
Yeah, I mean, I think look at the data on why people exit the field. They exit the field through frustration in dealing with bureaucratic nonsense that has nothing to do with teaching. They exit the field less often because they're very frustrated by parents, and they're exit the field because they have duties during the day that seem to have nothing to do with teaching. There's a little bit too much time doing lunchroom duty and so on. So what I'd like to see is teachers relieved of much of that work that does not make a very direct contribution to better educating children. And I'm more focused on retention than I am bringing more people into the field, because I see that as the more urgent problem. Let's not lose experienced teachers.
Yeah, Carrie?
Yeah, I think Dan's right on that. I think that the research also shows that teachers leave the field when they don't feel supported. And so I think as chiefs, you know, state chiefs, our job is to see how can we put structures in place to make teachers feel supported, like coaches that go out to schools and support them in their work. And also making sure that our leaders know what it means to support the teachers in their buildings. Because I think if a teacher will tell you, you know, I didn't leave because of the pay. I left because I didn't feel I was being supported either inside my building or by the district. So I think as state chiefs, we need to work with our leaders in order to build those kinds of environments. And we also need to make sure that we are putting our structures in place, like for professional learning, for coaching, that so teachers feel that they're continuing to grow.
Yes, for me, one Rorschach test is simply to ask how much collaborative planning time do we give our teachers in our
Mhm.
public schools, right? I
Mhm.
mean, it's a thermometer of our respect for them as professionals, right? If we just have them teach one darn class after another like a conveyor belt, right, with no time to think, no time to plan, that reflects on, you know, their view of how we're treating them, quite understandably. And that's a battle for time and for resources, of course, which continues to this day. Well, I want to just thank all of you. This is a subject that I suspect will be with us. We may be meeting 2 years from now and 4 years from now, but I do want to close with a shout out to Dr. Wright. I mean, you've shown us that learning to read doesn't have to be totally determined by the wealth of your background family. We've still got, even in Mississippi, work to do for our poorest kids. I know you'd be the first to say that. But you know, in the poorest state in the nation, you are getting results in terms of learning to read that are better than the nation's average, right? I mean, that's just astonishing. And I think it shows us that we can make progress, and Louisiana shows us that we can teach children to be readers of information and fiction and nonfiction if we give them the text from the beginning, right? If we give them the text. So thank you all very, very much for joining us for this conversation. And thank you, everyone who's watching. Deeply appreciated. And please, please, let's all work together. This is a problem that is a nation's to solve. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks so much.